Okay, it's been a while. But I'm back now, so no need to say much more. And I thought I'd come back with another look at a once popular subject, that being classic arcade ports from the ZX Spectrum. A look at how tiny teams, sometimes of no more than a single solitary weed-addled bedroom coder, transplanted everyone's arcade favourites for play on the UK's favourite, and most assuredly #1 home computer. Now this time I'm not going to do the whole good port versus bad port thing. Instead I've got 9 games, mostly pretty good ones that either I missed the first time round, or am pretty damn familiar with. Now, before we start, a reminder that seeing as this is the ZX Spectrum, we're not looking for anything close to arcade accuracy here. You're not going to get it. Not ever. Not even remotely close. We're looking for things that make the most of what little the Speccy has got, and use whatever workarounds needed to turn a big arcade blockbuster into a perfectly decent home computer game. Got it? Good. Let's go. Now this is definitely one of the bigger ones I missed the last time. Chase HQ, ported by Ocean to the system in late 1989, is pretty much the guidebook example of how to do an arcade port on the Speccy right. The original, by Taito, you know, the game where you chase a bad guy down and ram the hell out of them, isn't even anywhere close to being an arcade favourite of mine, but even I can respect the brilliance of this port. The gameplay is as good as it could possibly have been. It's got the turbo, it's got the busy roads, and it has as much speed as the Spectrum could possibly muster. The graphics are also pretty great for the Speccy. Nice detailed monochrome sprites are plenty. They probably could have been fancier, but attempts to do so might have screwed up the speed, and also there's no colour bleed. But really, Chase HQ on the Spectrum shines on the presentation front most of all. For fans of the Speccy, this might be even more iconic than the arcade game itself. Those little portraits, and all the radio chatter between Nancy and yourself as you go about the mission. Radio chatter that gets more and more animated as you start to rhythmically nail your target, ramming your big engine into them again and again. I mean, holy shit, I don't even want to think about what this guy's doing in the seat next to you. And after you finally ban the car to oblivion and your fellow detective wipes himself up, you bask in the glory of a job well done, move on to another successful mission, and it all continues until you finally fuck up and Nancy wonders aloud whether you should have picked another career. Being a fluffer, for example. Chase HQ is brilliant. Even the sound is fucking great in this game, and when you're talking about a Spectrum game being a winner in the sound department, you know that the game's a winner in every possible way it could be. There's games that I do prefer over this one, but I absolutely wouldn't argue with anyone who called Chase HQ the greatest arcade port in the history of the ZX Spectrum. So with Chase HQ freshly in mind, let's look at a driving arcade port that missed the mark. Outrun, alas, was doomed to basically never get a fully decent port to home systems. I previously scorched the Amiga's hideous attempt at Outrun in a much earlier video, and you'll be disappointed to know that the Spectrum's effort was provided by largely the same people. Yeah, it's a US gold joint. The doubly annoying thing here is that at least half of the team behind this worked on the Speccy port of Enduro Racer, which is actually perfectly decent and could easily have been here too. So how come they managed to screw up Outrun? There's several things, really. First off is an old classic from the Nemesis review in the first video, the doctored publicity screenshot. The examples here for Outrun are not as blatant as those in Nemesis, but still, those trucks aren't half big, are they? Well, here's them in the actual game. Minor thing, but it's still an annoyance when you find it out. This game was massively hyped as the Spectrum's definitive arcade port prior to release, and doctored screenshots are kind of a consequence of that. As it goes, when you get into the game you find that US Gold didn't need to doctor things all that much. The roads are fairly busy, and they tried to stick in as much variation in cars and in background as they possibly could. You even get music in 1:8K, versions of both Magical Sound Shower and Splash Wave are present. The trouble in fact is that Outrun is almost trying to do too much, more than the system can handle. I have to stress that the Spectrum is not a powerful machine in any way, and when too much appears on the screen the graphics almost seem to become quite garbled. It tends to lose a lot of info, and Outrun is a prime example of that. And the slowdown in this game can be crippling. When you get to the ancient stone archers on the third stage of the left route, you'll wonder if the game's actually moving at all. It's almost like a Tiger Electronics game or something. And there's another thing that's a result of all of this, that absolutely destroys the game. Outrun has a multi-load system, right in the middle of the game. When you complete one part of the course, the game stops, you have to play the tape, and the Speccy has to load the next part of the course into memory. Repeat at least 4 times over the course of a single playthrough, though if you do it again it actually doesn't have to do the multi-load again. If you're playing this on emulator, as I am, you won't notice it, but on a Spectrum, imagine playing the game and stopping in the middle for 2 minutes to wait for the next part to load. And imagine just how disruptive that would be when playing a game like Outrun. You spend more time loading the game than you do playing it, and it's just unworkable. One of the best things about Chase HQ as a port that I didn't mention, there isn't a multi-load system, and there certainly isn't one that occurs slap bang in the middle of the game. Chase HQ kept things simple enough for the Speccy to handle fairly easily. This game didn't, and the multi-load is an unfortunate necessity that becomes a stone around the game's neck. Outrun tried and pushed really hard, but alas it was just too packed with shit to do the game justice on the Speccy. Next up is something that in and of itself isn't particularly good, but I did used to play it a lot. Dragon Ninja. Obviously this is much more well known as Bad Dudes, the uber schlocky Data East classic where you prove yourself a bad enough dude to rescue Wally. This is the European version of said game which for whatever reason was made utterly generic. You don't even rescue any kind of president, just don a tank top and punch and kick some dudes. Simple as that. In fact, I always thought that you were the so-called Dragon Ninja of the title. It wasn't until later on that I realised that the Dragon Ninja are actually the villains of the game. And here it is on the Spectrum. Now I recall it being quite popular here, especially when it became a hit squad budget title available for £3. And honestly it's easy to see why. Bad Dudes or Dragon Ninja or whatever isn't even anywhere close to being a great arcade game. You walk right, hit some baddies, and that's it. But conversely, it's pretty hard to actually fuck up a game like this. After all, you walk right, hit some baddies, and that's it. Dragon Ninja on the Spectrum takes advantage of this and provides an experience that's pretty close to the arcade in gameplay. It's busy enough and hitty enough to cover all the bases. And as it goes, I used to like this game a lot back in the arcades. I always played it and I was quite good at it. Hell, I haven't played this version for over 20 years and I still made it to the 5th stage on 1 credit. It's not actually all that difficult, but it does bring back memories. I loved the arcade at the time, the thought of playing it at home was fantastic, and it managed to pay off nicely. Dragon Ninja covers the bases of a Speccy arcade port nicely, even if it's not exactly rocket science. But more importantly, it was definitely one of my most played Spectrum games, and it's quite nice to live it all over again. It'll never be a classic, but it's a sentimental favourite for sure. Okay, want some more ambitious side-scroller action that's more famous under another name? Here you go. This is Gryzor, converted by Ocean Software in 1988 from the original by Konami. Gryzor is the European name for the arcade known to virtually everyone else as Contra, which was then dubbed Probotector for its NES release over here that saw our bleached blonde muscle men replaced by robots. I mean, at least here you've still got the beefcake. Now, the reason behind Probotector, by the way, is simple, and on Wikipedia. The game would have likely been prohibited in Germany in its original form due to men shooting other men, making it unsellable to children, and rather than change it just for Germany and make Gryzor for other countries, Konami decided to change it to robots for all the PAL regions. Makes me wonder if the name's actually short for Prohibition Protector. Yeah, probably not though. Anyway, I digress, and for once I'm not doing it to hide a totally average game. Gryzor is pretty freaking intense and fast on the Spectrum, much more so than what you'd have probably expected. The graphics aren't exactly much to write home about, but that's not exactly a big deal. And yet, as you might have expected, the game is majorly difficult. There's one particularly annoying thing about this version of the game. All of the bullets are tiny, you can barely see them, and enemy bullets are indistinguishable from your bullets. This often means that you end up dying a lot without knowing what actually hit you, and considering that you're never going to lay off the fire button while playing this, that makes it pretty damn tough to learn. Oh, and there are no continues in this version. And no Konami code either. And the spray weapon sucks. Good luck. But pretty much everything from the arcade game is here, including the corridor stages. Pretty neat feat if I say so myself. I'd certainly recommend this if you're the sort of gamer who's played NES Contra to the point where you think it's now a piece of piss. Play this version of the game, and it'll have you weeping all over again. However, when it comes to side-scrolling shooty action from the arcade to your Speccy, for most people this is the kin right here. Another Data East game, another game that isn't exactly a favourite of mine or anything, but it runs the shit on the spectrum. Midnight Resistance, which found its way to the machine courtesy, once again, of those top bananas at Ocean Software in 1990. The first thing to notice is the game's really quite awesome music. It sticks out as one of the more solid and action-packed Speccy soundtracks of the day, on a system that wasn't exactly known for good music, or even for having more than one bit of music in the game, which this does. And also, well, there's some really quite nice graphics. The explosions on this game, if you can believe that, are spectacular. Beautiful, multicoloured vistas of destruction. It somehow manages to be one of the prettiest games on the system. Sure as hell isn't monochrome, that's for sure. Gameplay-wise, it works out pretty well. You actually don't really notice too much that the game is flip screen for a start. There's enough action on every screen for it to be satisfying, and the sprites move quite fast as it is. The somewhat awkward for my taste control scheme from the arcade has been retained here, although somehow it's a little easier to deal with on the Speccy. Still, it's not an easy game. It takes quite a lot to learn and, again, there are no continues. Actually, one thing you do notice about a lot of these Speccy arcade ports from the outset is that you always tend to get quite a few lives. Both this and Gryzor give you around 7 to 8 to start with, but there's no continues. Kinda weird that. My guess is that they did it so that they wouldn't feel it necessary to start you from the beginning of a level after a continue, preventing the Speccy from having to load all of that back into memory again, thus creating a multi-load. This might be especially true of a game like this, which is in essence one long, continuous level. Look into Speccy programming and you'll soon see that it's all about lots of little workarounds like that. Either way, Midnight Resistance is a really good Speccy port of another Data East bit of arcade fun. If only Chelnov had came to the system, that would really be something. Okay, so there needed to be one shooter in here at least, and this is my pick for today. Jaleco's Saint Dragon, converted by Storm in 1990. An odd little one this, as I'm not sure I've ever actually heard anyone talk about Saint Dragon, even though I've known the game for years. Even though shooters are always the hot and tasty thing in the world of retro games, with new ones dragged up from obscurity every year and sold for a bomb, this one remains almost completely forgotten. I suppose that there is a good reason for this. Unlike a lot of shooters, Saint Dragon was never ported to any of the consoles bar a Japan only and by all accounts cack-handed port for the PC engine, and is largely available on home computers only. If you ever get the chance to pick up the Amiga version of this game, do so. It's really freaking good, very close to the arcade, and for whatever reason it's totally obscure and probably cheap as chips. However, this is the version I know the most, on the Speccy. In all likelihood you're totally unfamiliar with this game, so here's the crack. Unlike most space shooters where you're in charge of a ship, here you play as a gigantic frickin' mechanised dragon. The dragon does have some advantages compared to smaller, lifer models. It's only vulnerable at the head, so you can move in such a way that you use your tail to block shots coming your way. And you will need to, because despite that this game is still brutally, viciously, almost incomparably difficult. In 25 years, I've gotten past the first stage of this game once. It has to be said that this game is very impressive on the spectrum. It is to 1 to 8K what R-Type was to 48K in a sense, and it uses a lot of the same tricks, from a largely black background that makes for virtually no noticeable colour bleed, to massive looking sprites that are actually a bunch of smaller sprites moving in unison, see the Pumas here for a good example. And it doesn't let up just because it's the Spectrum. The game throws tons of shit at you, forever. And it does it with barely noticeable slowdown. It's there, but not in the way. Quite neat. Saint Dragon as a game is just all about careful movement, always making sure your tail is close to hand. Defense and offense. You can throw a lot of shit back and the game actually won't power you down when you lose a life or even a credit, but unlike a lot of shmups you're gonna need all the skill in the world in terms of movement to stand any sort of chance. It pretty much becomes too much when you reach the first boss, a ball that takes up about 3/4 of the play area, moves as fast as you do, and leaves you to desperately move around the remaining quarter while it also fires shit at you before inevitably crushing you. Yeah, like I said, I've beaten this guy once. Saint Dragon is technically impressive, but I'm fully aware that it's probably way too hard for most people. If I hadn't already played it as a kid, it'd be way too hard for me. It didn't receive a particularly good reception at the time, and was already quite obscure to begin with. But hey, I'll champion it. It deserves some recognition at least. You should probably play it on the original arcade or on the Amiga over this one, but still, play it. It might be a lot better than you think. And then someone else can actually talk about Saint Dragon. Now you might have noticed that quite a lot of the games here are 128K affairs, using all the processing power that the Speccy had available to it. No real reason for that aside from me growing up with the 128K plus 2 version of the Spectrum. By the time I got it, the system was already out of Sir Clive's hands, part of the Amstrad Empire, and kinda getting ready to die out. But for some that's not the true Spectrum. For some it's all about 48K, it's about fleshy keyboards, rigged up tape recorders and beeper noise. So in the words of M&8, I got a little something for you. A 48K arcade port of a game that frankly should have needed 128K and then some. It's Space Harrier. Now this is seriously ambitious to be sure. Getting Space Harrier into 48K at all is no mean feat, but Elite and the programmer behind this probably couldn't have done any more than they did. Oh, by the way, the programmer's name is Keith. The game makes sure to let you know this all the time. Kinda miss games being signed like that. Anyway, the game actually gives the appearance of moving seriously fast. It's one of the few times you'll see this sort of speed in any Spectrum game. I'm sure it's all totally smoke and mirrors in some way, and it helps that the game always gave you the illusion of speed in the first place, what with the grid and everything. But still, Frame Rate Police can certainly shut the fuck up about this one. Perhaps one of the reasons why it's so fast is because all the sprites are quite small. Perhaps too small, making it quite difficult to see what you're doing or what hit you. Another game where you always miss what kills you, but usefully another game that gives you a ton of lives from the off. And it's certainly something to look at too. Perhaps the colour scheme might be a bit too much for some in fact. Monochrome pink doesn't exactly tend to be easy on the eye, and it doesn't get a whole lot better from there. Still, it is Space Harrier, on the Spectrum in 48K, and honestly, I would certainly rate it over the NES version, and I'd probably rate it over the bigger but jerkier C64 version too. If only there were a 128K version of it, with the classic music and everything, then we'd really be cooking. Overambitious? Yes, but also an overachiever that does a fine job. Speaking of ambitious, there always has to be one game in this video that tries to bring a big ass and very modern for the time arcade game to such a tiny computer, and usually those games fail pretty hard. The subject in question today is TMNT 2 The Coin Op, or rather TMHT, because we're in Europe and we don't like ninjas. Naturally it's called that to differentiate it from the original home computer console TMHT game, and to make it perfectly clear that this is a version of the classic Konami beat-em-up that everybody loves. This is quite a late arrival for the machine too, released in 1991. But hey, inferior hardware didn't stop the NES from producing a really fine version of this coin-op, so maybe the Spectrum can pull it off too. So, how does it fare? Well, it's okay. You've got all 4 turtles, you've got all the levels, all the bosses, and plenty of foot soldiers. Don't expect there to just be 2 on screen at a time. This game can fit as many as 6 onto a screen, plus your character, and it can do it without any slowdown. Not bad. It's just, well, not all that much to speak of. TMNT as a coin-op relied a lot on pizzazz. It was loud, brash, and it had the frickin' turtles. A proper arcade experience, not the deepest when it came to gameplay, but full of pizzazz. This is kind of just another beat-em-up. When all the foot soldiers are in monochrome, when you're stuck with the same couple of attacks to beat them, and there's no music, it tends to get a bit boring. Still, you can play it with a friend too, which is nice, but honestly that's the bare minimum you would expect from any beat-em-up. The multi-load once again doesn't help either. This game not only loads at the start of a level, it loads in the middle of a level too. Yeah, you won't notice it these days on Emu, but I can assure you that we all did in 1991. It's things like this that made kids bored of waiting to play games and got them going out, abusing solvents and stealing cars instead, I'm telling you. It's kind of an unfortunate fact that when you play this game, you always go back to one thought. Why am I not currently playing Target Renegade instead? Target Renegade, the game that both popularised and killed beat-em-ups on the machine in a single blow. And alas, TMNT was no exception. It tried, and it's hardly bad or anything, just rather average on here in the end. And finally, the one game that I inexplicably failed to cover in the first video is here. Graft Gold's version of the sequel to Bubble Bobble, Waynebow Islands. Now, Waynebow Islands is these days a largely forgotten home computer monolith. The versions of the game on consoles at the time were in various ways disappointing and or unfinishable, but this game was the undisputed top dog on home computers. Something about it just hit. Waynebow Islands isn't just regarded as one of the Spectrum's greatest games, it's regarded as one of the Amiga's greatest too. It held the top spot on Amiga Power's Top 100 for a good couple of years. You'll also find it in top 100 lists for the C64 too. It was a winner virtually across the board, loved by everyone, regardless of what house they represented. Anyway, this is the Spectrum version, and the thing that should immediately stick out is how pretty and just how colourful it is. On a system that was barely capable of producing 8 colours at a time, it kinda stands out in just how beautiful it looks and how that colour sticks out. It was the sort of game that you would see in magazines and scoff at how doctored the screenshots clearly were, only this time you played it and found out that they weren't at all. The aim of the game is for Bubby and or Bobby to fire rainbows that will help them both beat baddies and get them to the top of the level. You can walk across them and use them as a sort of staircase, but if you jump on them they'll disappear. You can power yourself up to produce up to 3 rainbows at a time, and yeah, the Spectrum handles that without issue. But like in most shooters, you power down if you lose a life. Starts out simple, gets damn hard pretty fast. Classic Taito arcade action. And on the Spectrum it's pretty much flawless. The game even has the peppy Somewhere Over the Rainbow soundtrack to boot. The only thing stopping it from being perfect as an arcade version is, obviously, the graphics. And there's slowdown too, but while the music does get affected by this a lot, you don't really notice slowdown in the gameplay all that much. It's not that sort of a game. It's even got separate boss music, which is something you almost never got on the Spectrum. And sound effects! The levels, the enemies, the power-ups, the collectibles, all virtually intact. This game is just sorcery. You look at it and it seems so far beyond virtually every other Spectrum title that you wonder just how the hell Graft Gold went about doing it. Kind of a shame that they largely made games for the C64 really. Maybe that had something to do with it. Waynebow Islands is a brilliant game, no doubt about it, and it's not even one that I particularly have any childhood association with either, because I barely touched it then. The class of it is just permanent, and it'll never not be a brilliant arcade conversion. It goes without saying that it's the best game in the whole video, and a nice one to end things on. So there you have it. 9 more Spectrum arcade ports for you to quite possibly enjoy, whether you do it on something like Spectaculator, or whether you fire up your ancient old machine, or even if you're going to do it on a frickin' mobile or something. I tend to quite enjoy doing videos like these, and who knows, maybe there'll be a third one for the Speccy in the pipeline, or another one for the Amiga, or maybe even one for the C64, even though that's not exactly my home court. We'll have to see. For now though, I'll let the classic melancholy Target Renegade music play out while we all bask in some nice, good old-timey monochrome memories of the days when just the thing that slightly, even if only very slightly resembled the proper arcade experience, was enough. Bye for now.